Now, you'll recall that France had entered the war in 1778. A year later, in 1779, Spain also entered the war against Great Britain. Just like France, Spain had lost to Great Britain during the French and Indian War and sought to disrupt the trade of its enemy and regain some of its territories that it had lost at that time. Also, like France, Spain was kind of an unusual ally. It was a monarchy, it was Catholic, and it was also a colonial power, so it wasn't very sympathetic to the U.S., but nevertheless, it sought to harm Great Britain. Also, like France, Spain had been sending supplies as early as 1776, at a time when Britain had blocked most of the eastern seaboard with its navy. Spain was sending supplies through New Orleans and up the Mississippi River, mostly gunpowder, blankets, and clothes. These would arrive in the Western theater of the United States and then find their way to other areas of military interest. Spain had also permitted American privateers to dock in its very rich port of Havana. But the most important thing that Spain had done is it had provided silver coins, sometimes as loans, sometimes as gifts, to the American Congress, which allowed them to stay afloat and pay certain debts. And in fact, in 1780, King Carlos III of Spain declared a royal order asking Spanish and Indian males to donate money to the American cause. So supplies of money from Spain were used throughout the war, and they also permitted certain military leaders, such as Baron von Steuben and Casimir Pulaski, to be employed by the American side. So again, like Spain, or like France, Spain saw this as a key opportunity to harm its enemy, Great Britain. Now, at this time, Britain was the most powerful country in Europe, and you can tell because France has already entered the war, and now Spain is entering the war, and Britain is still holding its own. What's interesting is that Spain was not interested at all in supporting colonial independence, and in fact, it refused to acknowledge the Declaration of Independence. It instead took this as an opportunity to maintain its alliance with France and to try and gain some properties. What's interesting about this is that Spain refused to fight on American soil or in American waters, and instead they had very specific aims. They agreed to go to war if France would help them try and reclaim Gibraltar from the British. Now, Gibraltar was a fort that was located on the Mediterranean. It was also located right next to Spanish land, and it was on the Iberian Peninsula. Spain thought it belonged to them, and the British had held Gibraltar for quite some time. Spain and France would attempt to control and take Gibraltar for the next 4 years, but ultimately they would fail. Spain also intended to get the island of Minorca, which was located off the Spanish mainland in the Mediterranean. Britain had held both of these since 1704, and they would end up retaining Gibraltar, but they would lose Minorca. Spain also intended to increase its wealth by licensing privateers to take advantage of British trade. When Spain joined the war, they immediately began working on Gibraltar. And then also, they began shipping large supplies of stores up the Mississippi River. They also took a small army up the Mississippi and captured places like Natchez and defended St. Louis at one point. And then they began working in the early 1780s across the southern coast, taking parts of Louisiana and eventually capturing Florida. In late 1782, they also captured the Bahamas well after the American hostilities had ended. So you can see that Spain joining the war actually adds an additional 2 fronts to Britain's control. First off, there's fighting in the Mediterranean now. In addition to all the fighting that France had added, and in addition to the fighting in North America, now the Mediterranean was active as well. And they also began working up the Mississippi and across into Florida. My point in telling this story is for you to realize that in 1778, France joined the war and the war became global. In 1779, Spain joins the war as well, and British forces are thinned even further.